Merci, Madame Chair. Et je voudrais aussi remercier l'Académie du Maroc, mais je vais parler en remercier en anglais. C'est pas pourquoi je ne suis pas philosophe. Ça peut retirer un peu les dommages de mon accent, de tous les auditeurs là-bas. Et enfin, c'est une langue avec le mérite d'être très directe, très pragmatique. Alors, possiblement, ça change un peu le ton de la discussion, du débat. Good. So, if the translation is working, let me make 3 points about what I would like to say to you, because we have to be short today. The first is that while everyone understands that what is going on in the Palais de Congrès is about implementing the Paris Accords of last year, and we all understand that the Paris Accords are not perfect yet, there is a lot of good news, and I want to emphasize where that good news is coming from. The story in climate has made substantial progress, but at the same time, I want to stress that what happened in Paris last year has also been a kind of an evolution. It has changed the agenda of climate change from what we struggled with in the first 30 years or 23 years of the history of climate change since 1992 to a new set of issues, and I would like to say something about those changes that have occurred. And the last thing I want to say, I think also may be interpreted as another kind of good news. From the beginning, there has been a tension, as Lucien said, between the question of economic growth in both developed countries and certainly in the developing countries, a tension with the notion of environmental legislation or environmental treaties, particularly with regard to climate change. And my suggestion is going to be that that tension, that sense of conflict, is disappearing after Paris in a double way. The first way is, if we do not grow substantially compared to what economies are doing now, there simply is not capital funding to build the new infrastructure that is necessary to do what is needed for climate change. In that sense, you must grow, because without growth, there will be no investment that is sufficient to create the technologies, the conditions, some of which were just discussed, to manage climate change. But there's a second sense as well. There's no question that the way we have produced food and the way we have produced energy for the last 150 years has certainly had certain byproducts that were unintended, but are the causes of climate change. We basically ate up resources, whether land or energy, for agriculture or for industrialization, that produce these effects that we now understand much better with respect to greenhouse gases. And the mode of industrialization and the mode of agriculture that we have used to grow rich through much of the world, and which has been the model that developing countries are following, will continue to produce these unintended effects unless we find a way to grow which is much less intensive in the way it uses resources. And yet, just as we had at the very end of that last discussion about shared mobility, connected cars that you were talking about, there are technologies on the horizon that are of a different character than those we have been using for our basic production of food, transportation, mobility, buildings, which promise a substantial reduction in the inefficiency with which we have used resources, and that is the source of the climate risk we're trying to manage. So those are my 3 points: that there is good news, which I will describe. There are changing conditions in climate change post-Paris, and there are the possibilities of new forms of production, new technology, if you will, digital technology, many names. But it's all about the same thing, and those hold out a promise to us of receiving better services more cheaply, but without these byproducts that are the source of climate risk. So those are the 3 things that I would like to talk about. I don't have time, obviously, to do all of it in any detail, so I just like to make some highlighted points and suggest where you can get more information if you are provoked by these points. So first, the primary question of the last 25 years of negotiating climate has been, how much more does it cost to do things? You can call it green, you can call it sustainable, a whole series of ways that involve much less climate and other environmental risk than it does, how much more does it cost to do it differently than the way we have done it. And the good news is that while we have fought about this in the negotiations, both how much more does it cost and who's going to pay those extra costs, what we now see is that the costs, the differences between brown and green, have been very, very substantially reduced. Now, it's a long story. I think behind me there is a chart, and I'll simply use one anecdote to explain what I mean by this. About 10 years ago, when we were preparing for the negotiations in Copenhagen, we were asked by the negotiators to prepare a chart that shows how much more it costs to do different things green than to do them brown, the way they were being done. And this is what came out. And it's a curve that goes up. But the key thing that I want to point out is, if we were asked to do this same thing today, much of the space in the middle and right side of the chart, here, over, those costs would be completely different. They have collapsed. In other words, because of what goes on in solar and wind, not necessarily for climate change, but because we have learned, sometimes in Germany, sometimes in China, how to do these things much more cheaply. That chart, if we did it today, would be much less steep. And the result of that is that we can now, if we were to recalculate the number of how much more it costs to do things green than brown, which was one of the main sources of this figure of $100 billion to be transferred from north to south, that number would be very, very much smaller. Now, that has some implications for the negotiation, and they have already been realized in many ways, because I would suggest to you that one of the things that happened at Paris was that governments, both in developed and developing countries, realized that these incremental costs, these added costs of doing things green, had become much, much less than they were. And they took on pledges, NDCs as they're now called, nationally determined contributions, to say, we can do this, and we will do this within a certain time frame reaching out until 2030. So the economics, I suggest, have been, the microeconomics, the cost differences, have changed very much. What is now ahead of us in the post-Paris world? Well, the issue is now implementation of these contributions, these pledges. And that means you actually have to move from planning to making deals. And those deals can be very tricky, because just as you have seen here in Morocco with Ouarzazate, I was working on that with the government 5 years ago, and it began to operate this year. It takes time, and it will take more time to expand it further, because much will depend on how Europe treats the import of power from the new phases of Ouarzazate, which is still an open question. So there are many, many issues of regulation, of law, of technical permits that are needed to go from planning to actually building out the plants, even though the economic differences have become much less. That is the problem of the present. And of all of those problems, perhaps the most difficult is finance. Where will the money come from? Because to actually implement, to go the last kilometer, in English we say the last mile, that is there, all the estimates are we will have to have twice as much finance between now and 2035 for these large infrastructure plants that are necessary to produce power cheaply, or for the different sorts of traffic control systems where you have automated cars. All of this is going to cost what is estimated to be twice the current rate of investment. Right now, we are basically investing globally about $45 trillion a year. That's mille milliards, trillion. It's a lot of money. It has to go to 90. Okay, it has to double. In energy, that's about 6 trillion will be needed, where we're spending 3 right now across the world. 60% of that is in developing countries. So we face a problem that used to be about added costs or microeconomics, and now it has become finance. And to make it more difficult, if I can make this move. This, by the way, will be a major discussion in 2 weeks in COP22. It has to do with the $100 billion question of transfers has not gone away simply because relative prices have changed. And so these are reports that my organization did with the OECD last year about how are the developed countries doing in transferring money. This will be a principal issue. There's a new roadmap that will be issued. You can all look at it. It's not public yet. But it suggests that the amounts of public money transferred in 2020, public means government money, from north to south will be about 68 billion milliards each year, and that then there will be incremental private money, what is represented here by the red. We'll see. And there'll still be some fights over exactly what counts along these lines. But this will be a principal issue that will kind of tie the old period of climate to the new period. But I want to take you here. This looks impossible, right? No one can understand such a chart. What it's trying to do is to figure out where the money is coming from that actually funds this new infrastructure, that funds green. And there are only 2 things, I don't know, that I want you to notice. The larger part of the money across the world is public money, not private money. It comes from various forms of national development banks, from multilateral banks, from bilateral assistance. But most of the money is public, and most of the money is national, not international. It's developing countries through their own financial systems, private and public, that are providing the bulk of this money to this point. And there's an interesting question about whether this is going to change so that it will become increasingly private. But I want to make one point that's very important, particularly in emerging markets. This is a picture of what most of the world looks like. If we were to have a serious change in the way oil is used, for example, which is oil and gas, which fossil fuels that we've pictured here, most of the loss, if you suddenly wrote off all the assets around the world that are associated with producing oil and gas and all the profits that go with it, most of that loss is borne by national governments. Very little is borne by Total, BP, Exxon, because most of the oil and gas assets in the world are owned by national governments. And they take their money in a variety of ways: production sharing, tax rates, various forms of royalties. My point is that much of what we are talking about here are the assets or the balance sheets of governments and government companies. So if there is a substantial change, really very little of that is going to be borne by the multinational companies. It'll mean a lot to them, of course. If you're a shareholder or anyone else who's associated with British Petroleum, it can be a substantial cut in your expectations. But at a global level, it is governments that take most of the profit, most of the benefit from this, and that has to be understood in the political economy of how we change away from the systems of production that we currently have. In China, to make my point stronger, there is no private economy in the energy sector. It is purely public. State banks, state companies, state taxes. So in China, that margin would disappear at the top completely. And if we don't take this into account, we're never going to understand how a change can possibly come. So my point, it is mostly public money, it is mostly national money that has to be doubled. Okay? And what's the problem? The problem is now macroeconomics, the state of economies around the world. Growth has basically ended for all practical purposes in the advanced industrial economies as of 2008. It actually started down before that, before the financial crisis in 2006. But growth has become extremely low, less than half of what it was. And as you here in Morocco, or if we were in China or Brazil or South Africa, even India to some degree, you would find that growth has gone from sometimes in China, they said it was 11%. It's down very close to zero now if you actually account properly for what those growth rates are. And so we are all caught in a prolonged period of low growth, and we don't know how long it will be, and we don't know how to get out, because our traditional macroeconomic tools like monetary policy are not working. And where we see this really most manifest is in the reluctance of investors to put their money into the long-term economy, into long-term projects like infrastructure. And the reason is they don't trust the ability to recover that money 10 to 15 years into the future. So we have what is a financial problem that ties to the growth rates that we are facing, and this problem is most severe where we most need the new capital to deal with climate change, namely in the emerging markets. So that's the problem we face. It's a serious one, and can I take 2 or 3 minutes more? Good. It's very nice of you. Let me just say, having put all this terrible stuff in front of you, after my good news about costs coming down, I suddenly hit you with this question that the world doesn't have capital to rebuild this infrastructure, which we see. And so let me just say something about that. The problem of climate change today is basically a problem of finance and macroeconomics and growth. Okay? It is not the microeconomics of how much more it costs to do a power plant that runs on solar thermal than a power plant that runs on coal. Those questions have been, I'm not going to say resolved, but certainly made much easier. And what we are really talking about is sustainable infrastructure in energy, transport, agriculture, and building, the 4 sectors that are responsible for most climate change. I raised the question earlier, where's this money going to come from, this investment money to build this infrastructure? And everybody hopes, and all the negotiations, what you'll hear over and over is, well, we're using public money, government money now, but private actors are going to take over. I raised 2 questions with you about that. The first is that many of the risks that investors face in highly regulated sectors like energy or transport are risks created by governments themselves. They're often called regulatory risks or currency risks. But generally, when you have someone who is associated with a project over time, and they are the creators of the risk, they are probably the best parties to bear that risk, to take it on. If the public is creating the risk, then the public is probably in the best position to manage that risk because it's involved in both sides of the game. So as long as you have highly regulated sectors, which these are, it's very hard to see how public money will not be involved one way or another, although there are many instruments we could use. And from the private sector side, if I'm a private investor, particularly one with a lot of money to invest, like a pension fund or an insurance company or a sovereign wealth fund who control most of the investable resources in the world, what we would find very quickly is they are extremely reluctant to get involved in owning assets from which they do not have a liquid possibility of moving out. The way they manage risk is to move relatively quickly between investments. They don't want things which are illiquid, where they can be locked in for 20 years, because it could be that their liabilities, what they have to pay their pensioners, start to change, but their income is locked in. So especially when you have very pronounced low growth, they tend to move almost completely into liquidity. That is to say, things that they believe they can move out of fast enough that if the market collapses, at least they're safe. Somebody else will bear the losses associated with it. It's a funny notion, but it's very, very important. And moreover, they are very reluctant to do cross-border lending. They do not have real knowledge about how an asset that is illiquid is going to perform if it is far away from the place where they are operating or where they feel they don't have influence. So the amount of private money that will move from Europe or from America into the developing world has proven very difficult to manage, partially because there are problems about knowing exactly what the risks are to that particular set of assets in which they are invested. And the third point I would make, which is essential, I'm suggesting that public finance will remain important in a very significant way, but every minister of finance who I know, and I used to be in a finance ministry, and every central bank head who I know, or every national bank head like the Caisse de dépôt de gestion here in Morocco, are all focused on this question of growth. Okay? That is their primary mandate. No one is telling them climate change is your most important structure or infrastructure is your most important issue. They are there to produce growth, poverty reduction, and jobs. And so unless we can come up with some way of proving that investment in this class of assets that we call sustainable infrastructure is really a key to improving growth here in Morocco or in Southern Africa or in China or in the United States, there is going to be reluctance to put that public finance at doubled rates into this class of assets. It's that I mean by saying the growth issue and the environmental issue have, in a sense, come together. And much of what we need to do now is to demonstrate that there really are productivity possibilities, growth possibilities in this class of assets that will make them appealing to finance ministers and development bank heads and central bank heads, so that targeting this class becomes an important part of their growth strategy. Now, why should anybody believe that? Well, we're trying to do a lot of work on the empirics of that to show that it works. But the main evidence that we may have another way to produce that is much more resource saving than the way we've been producing, but still will increase productivity or growth, is in this class of digital or new economy assets. We don't know yet because they haven't been built out at enough scale. But you can see here what has happened in Africa with one part of this, which was the telecom revolution, because people jumped over the entire last stage of production. Now, does this mean if we go out in the streets of Marrakesh, we're going to see automated cars? The way in my city, where I live in Palo Alto, about almost 40% of the cars on the street are automated. They're driving themselves. Doesn't mean it's going to happen here quickly, but it does mean we may be on the edge of something that brings us both growth and sustainability. And I'll be quiet now, except to say that there are major changes that have to occur if this change in production is going to occur. Some of them are in the way we design markets. We've built our energy markets around managing variable cost. That is, the costs of oil and gas and fuels that may or may not be on the market is what we have tried to create efficiency in the way we've done our policy. That has to change. You must build a system around intermittent energies like solar and the flexibility of systems to be available for people to use when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. Same thing on mobility. You have a different design of cities that operates when you have automated car systems. Buildings are starting to look completely different now as you have control systems of data that show that you can build stresses very differently, different shapes than we've used, many of which are more efficient. And perhaps the most difficult thing of all, beyond changing systems, is changing institutions. Because so many of the financial institutions we have, particularly in the public sector, are pretty inefficient. They can be corrupt, there's a lot of gaming, incentives are wrong, political interference takes place. So we are also talking about changes in the financial structure through which we could deliver money if we really thought that this was the way both to grow and to help the environment. And the very last thing I would say, an economy that runs on these types of technologies does not look like what I have been teaching at Stanford for the last 35 years. Because basically, let me just hold this machine up that you all know. And what it does is you can get all kinds of applications that cost you nothing once you have this machine. They can take pictures. And now we no longer have an industry that's called the photography industry. It's disappeared from GNP. It's disappeared from what we can tax. But we take 20 times as many pictures as we did only 15 years ago. In other words, what you have is a platform that is capital intensive and zero cost every time you touch it to turn something on. That is a completely different economy than the one that we've had, where you pay for the marginal cost of producing each item that you are going to use or consume. The challenges of that new economy are substantial, but at least that's a good challenge to face because it promises the potential for real growth and the potential to cut down the byproducts of the last period of industrialization that are making life very risky for all of us. So thank you very much.